Coming up on Maine Challenge, State Senator Shenna Bellows. Hello and welcome to Maine Challenge, a production of Lincoln County Indivisible and Lincoln County TV. Our guest today is State Senator Shenna Bellows from Manchester. Hi, Shenna. Welcome.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's nice to have you on the show. You are a state senator representing Southern Kennebec County. You want to tell us which towns? This is a test. If you don't remember the
I will, as if you're driving it. Chelsea, Randolph, Pittston, Gardner, West Gardner, Farmingdale, Hollowell, Manchester, which is where I live with my husband, Reedfield, Winthrop, and Monmouth.
Okay, what a collection of towns. Covers the gamut, doesn't it?
I feel really lucky.
We're going to get into your legislative work, but what else do you do? I am intimately aware of the fact that the legislature is not a full-time job. It's a citizen legislature, which means a paltry sum of money to compensate for the fact that you have 20,000 bosses who have different opinions on everything and want to tell you them all the time. What else do you do?
So I'm the executive director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, which is a remarkable center. We have a small museum in Augusta and a tremendous educational training program. Our mission is using the lessons of the Holocaust. We inspire people to reflect and act to confront prejudice and discrimination. And we have educators who go into schools or now virtually into schools. We do anti-racism and anti-bias education. This summer we've been doing teacher training, training teachers all over the state of Maine virtually, encouraging them to incorporate anti-bias and anti-racism into their curriculum and to teach about the Holocaust and that important history.
Wow, that's important work, and I'm certainly appreciative of that, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers are. As you serve in the legislature, you're finishing your second term, am I right?
That's right, and I'm running for a third term. I chair the Labor and Housing Committee, and I serve on your old committee, the Judiciary Committee. I have fond memories of when I was at the ACLU advocating on various Judiciary Committee issues when you were there, and now I have the good fortune to serve on that committee as well as chair the Labor and Housing Committee, and I also chair the Senate Ethics Committee.
Wow, busy. Do you have well, that's probably a bad question. I was going to ask you if you have a serious opponent.
I do, yeah. The mayor of Hollowell, which is probably my most liberal-leaning town, is running against me. And so this is a district that, like most of Maine, is very independent-minded. This district voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. It voted for Paul LePage twice and then Janet Mills. And so it's a district that definitely votes the person, not the party, which I think is true of so much of Maine.
And you've certainly made the case. I remember when you ran what I thought was a very good campaign against Susan Collins 6 years ago. And it was a principled campaign. And I, as a member of the legislature, really appreciated that. So you're doing a lot of really important work. And I assume that your constituents are aware of that it's not just there's a name up there with a D or an R next to it. There's a person who's working really hard to make this place a better place, if I can get a little corny here. In your work in the legislature, do you find that your other job sometimes dovetails with your work in the legislature?
Absolutely. We're in an extraordinary moment of national reflection on racial injustice and inequity. And so one of the most meaningful pieces of work that I've been doing in the legislature this summer is work proposed and inspired and led by the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Ethnic, and Indigenous Populations. That's a commission that was established last winter. The bill to do that went through the Labor and Housing Committee. And the commission proposed that we look at all of the bills in the legislature with regards to the question, will this bill negatively or positively change racial disparities in our state? And so we literally this summer looked at every remaining piece of language on bills that we hadn't yet voted on as a full Senate and House to ask that question. Will this have a negative or positive impact on racial disparities in our state? And how could we improve these bills to make sure that we're addressing that fundamental discrimination that is systemic and inherent in our healthcare systems and in our criminal justice system, certainly. And so that has been an extraordinary process and a really important one. On the Judiciary Committee, I've also been part of the conversations around the Indian Land Claims Settlement Act of 1980 and how the state might re-envision our relationship with Wabanaki tribes. A lot of people don't know that Maine's tribes are treated differently than any other tribes in the United States in not receiving that recognition of their sovereignty and the relationship with the federal government in that way. And so really taking a look at, can we finally as a state recognize the inherent sovereignty of Maine's Wabanaki tribes through renegotiation of the terms of the Settlement Act and passage of legislation. So that's been really important racial justice work happening right here in the state. We're also having a reckoning around our criminal justice system as well, because Maine does see racial disparities with regards to rates of arrest and incarceration of people of color, particularly Black men, and particularly young people. We see racial disparities in terms of the treatment of students in schools. And so we're looking at issues like bail reform. And we just looked at a bill to start collecting data around racial profiling and making sure that we take a sharper look at these systems and try to change them.
I remember when I read about the legislation enabling the commission that you speak of, and when I first saw it, I thought, boy, what a great idea. And then when I thought about it a minute, I said, wow, what a lot of work.
Totally. Yes, absolutely.
So I'm sure you
important work, right?
Oh, and absolutely.
And I think that's one of the challenges. You know, so often people think about racism as, you know, hate groups or white supremacist groups. But in fact, bias and racism, in fact, are everyday interactions and policies. And if we're not being explicitly anti-racist, then we're being complicit. So as hard as this work is, we have to do it.
And it's going to take a very wide consciousness raising on all of our parts to really make progress on this. And I think we're making some. I wish it was faster. And I think the work of, I hope that as the commission moves forward and gets towards completion, that there's a lot of public attention focused on the work of the commission and just the purpose of the commission, just the reason.
Right, and Representative Rachel Talbot Ross and Representative Craig Hickman are the two Black legislators in the legislature right now, and they are working and serving on the commission. I am a volunteer, not part of the commission, but many of us in the legislature recognize that we have some work to do. And so we gladly, when the commission asked us to participate in this process, we said, sign us up. And I think that's something that, you know, all of us have an opportunity to look around in our communities and think through, where can we make an impact, even if we're not formally appointed or named or serving in a formal role on something. How can we help?
Right. And that's so important that you don't have to be appointed or elected to a certain position to help in the cause. And this is such a critical one. Mm-hmm. And the fine lines are subtle, but the not so fine lines are scary. They're so big. And I really appreciate what you're doing. The process of the legislature, will we or won't we? Can you talk a little bit about the process of going back? And I understand the governor can call the legislature back, and I understand why the governor might want to have the legislature call itself back. And I'm just wondering, I mean, there were 500 bills or something that were left undisposed of when the legislature adjourned. The committees have been working, as I understand it, or a lot of the committees have been working ever since to dispose of those bills, get them ready. But now the Republicans just don't want to come back into session. And I'm trying to figure out what the justification is.
So Maine is really unique, and you remember this. Every bill that's introduced gets a public hearing and a vote in committee, and then votes even nominally on the floor of the House and the Senate. And what that means is that every idea has an opportunity in the marketplace of ideas to either rise or fall on its own merits, and not because of backroom deals or agreements made in secret. And that really distinguishes Maine from a lot of other states. You know, it's allowed us to be first in the nation on some remarkable and important civil liberties, civil rights, environmental, healthcare, and economic issues. And so one of the big questions, or one of the big debates, is Republican leaders requested that there be negotiations between the leadership of the Democrats and the leadership of the Republicans to agree ahead of time on only a small number of bills. And that's never the way the legislature has done things ever. And in fact, is really contrary to how our system is designed. And so Democratic leadership have pushed back and said, we have always dealt with every single bill. And the committees tend to, because of this pressure, often be unanimous on so much of the routine work, and sometimes unanimous in terms of saying this idea is not ready for prime time, we're going to vote unanimously, ought not to pass, and dispense with it. And where the committees are divided are some important, sometimes controversial, but important public policy issues that really matter to our constituents. And so the Democratic leadership have said, no, we have a process in place. It's one that has worked every year, and even during a pandemic, we have the procedures to do this safely, and we should not be engaged in backroom deals, but instead do this in the open and democratic way that we have always done it. And the Republicans have rejected that. And so the other thing that's unique about Maine is to reconvene, a majority of both parties have to agree. So even though Democrats control the House and Senate, Speaker Gideon or President Jackson can't just pull us back against the will of the majority of both parties. And so that's why we haven't reconvened. It's very disappointing. And I will say it's personally disappointing. So I really think we need to get big money out of politics. I'm a clean elections candidate because of that. I'll give you a short example. I sponsored a first in the nation internet privacy law to say that your internet service provider can't sell or share your data without your permission. Well, big data is big money. They spent over $181,000, according to Maine Public, to try to defeat that bill, probably more. And those companies, those corporations, they're in the State House, in their suits, lobbying every day, and then they're writing corporate checks. Well, Maine has some strict campaign finance laws. If the legislature were in session, those corporate lobbyists couldn't be writing checks for campaigns. Well, Republican leadership, Senator Jeff Timberlake, Representative Trey Stewart, who's running for the Senate, they have set up these fundraisers through the month of August into September. And those fundraisers would be illegal, not the fundraisers themselves, but the request to corporate lobbyists to write checks or the request for corporate PAC money would be illegal if the legislature were still in session. So I don't know that that has influenced their decision making, but it's certainly wrong that some of these big corporations are writing these big checks. Right now we're in an election season and there is work to be done in the legislature.
Well, that's an explanation that I didn't connect those dots. I knew about that situation, but I couldn't imagine that leaders, elected leaders of the great state of Maine would say, no, we're not going to go into session because we have to raise money from big corporations. Is astonishing to me. And I've never seen an explanation for, no, we're not going to do our jobs. They were elected to do a job.
We are elected to do a job and we should be meeting. There is so much need right now, whether it's unemployment, small business relief, appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, for schools and for frontline workers. Maine is the second best state in the nation in terms of incidence of the virus, and yet we have some critical public policy issues that we haven't addressed. Now, Governor Mills is doing an excellent job from an executive position in allocating resources to the hospitals, to nursing homes, to schools, and protecting that money. And to our credit, the legislature unanimously passed a sweeping COVID-19 emergency relief package last March, and we did provide, for example, for the school funding, sort of looking ahead to what might be happening this fall. But that said, we have a responsibility to our constituents. You know, take unemployment. There's some serious problems with that system. The Labor and Housing Committee met, and we've been having weekly briefings with the Maine Department of Labor. But if we're not able to pass legislation to fix some of these problems, there's only so much that can be done through executive and administrative action. So that's just one example. We're looking at an impending housing crisis. We're starting to see the eviction machinery move forward. And granted, small landlords are struggling too, right? Because we're in this economic crisis. Yeah. They are worried about defaulting on their mortgages or losing the property themselves. There must be work that the state can do from a public policy perspective to support both tenants and landlords and avoid homelessness and foreclosures, which are two huge problems that we definitely see looming on the horizon. So there's some critical work that we should be doing in the legislature right now. That's why I voted to go back. I voted twice now to go back. And I really do hope that the Republicans will reconsider their decision not to go back at this point.
I hope they're called to account for this lack of action. And I certainly, I'm just really distressed at how this campaign is going, because I see some good incumbents on both sides, actually. But I'm really concerned that we're in a political rabbit hole in terms of how we can get dialogue back, how we can get reasonable with each other again, and work out differences and help the people of Maine happen. Do you have any debates scheduled with your opponent?
Not yet. Although I always welcome debates. When I ran against Susan Collins, we were pushing for more debates. She was pushing for fewer. In the end, we ended up having 5. It'll be interesting to see how many debates happen this fall in that race.
I definitely want to talk a little bit about your campaign against Susan Collins as it applies to her race this year. But first, I want to ask do you think that Republican candidates, especially for the Senate, but really up and down the ticket, should be put on the spot and forced to say where they stand with President Trump and where they repudiate President Trump.
Absolutely.
And on issues like choice, on issues like health, on issues like, well, there's so many issues up and down. And I want to, I mean, my local race, the Republican candidate says that he's pro-choice. He says he's pro-gay rights. Well, how does that sit with the local Republican Party, and how does that sit with the national party? And, where is this coming from? I mean, are they going to be allowed to sidestep this whole question of, do you stand with President Trump or repudiate him?
Well, I definitely encourage local journalists, local media outlets to keep asking that question, because it's very important. I stand strongly and proudly with the Biden-Harris ticket. I think that Joe Biden understands the economic challenges that we face in this country. I think that he has the experience and that leadership. And most of all, I think he's really skilled in picking the best of ideas from both allies and opponents and moving those forward. You watch post-primary how he listened really carefully to what Senator Sanders and Senator Warren had proposed on the campaign trail, and in fact adopted elements of their agendas in the general election campaign. And I think that's really important. And to your point, we need to be able and willing to work across the aisle. So as chair of the Labor and Housing Committee, for example, I am a passionate proponent for supporting workers and supporting small businesses. So one of the things that we were able to do on a variety of issues that impact both businesses and workers, like paid time off, for example, or workers' compensation, we were able to get unanimous votes in our committee and unanimous votes moving forward because we brought business and workers together. We brought Republicans and independents and Democrats together. I think that's extraordinarily important. On my internet privacy law, that I really do think is groundbreaking, Republican Senator Stacey Guerin from the Bangor area was my chief ally, and we together made sure that that bill was bipartisan, because we both believe in privacy and we both believe in constitutional freedoms and protecting individual rights. So I do think that there are areas for common ground, but it's important to ask those tough questions. Where do people stand? What do they support and not support? And what would they do differently or not do differently? And how are they voting in November?
Moving on to Senator Collins. Is this the same Senator Collins that you ran against 6 years ago?
It's not.
I mean, I know it's the same person, but
it's not. So what was remarkable about the race, and granted, our polling never showed me in a close contest with Senator Susan Collins. So in some ways, she wasn't as intimidated or concerned about the electoral outcome, right? But I ran against her based on principle, because I had been deeply disappointed. For example, I was a leader on the marriage equality movement, and I organized or created Republicans for the Freedom to Marry, hired a full-time person, Jill Barkley, to recruit Republicans to support marriage equality. And we tried so hard to get Senator Susan Collins to endorse marriage equality in that referendum campaign of 2012, and she declined to do so. She would not end up endorsing marriage equality until 2 years after Maine voters endorsed marriage. Finally, in the 2014 campaign against me, she finally came out and said, yep, I do, I agree with Maine voters. So those are some of the reasons I ran against her. But she didn't run a nasty campaign. You didn't see personal attacks on me or on Democrats that were not founded in reality. So for example, she's been attacking Speaker Sarah Gideon for not bringing the legislature back to do this work. Well, we've already talked about that. Speaker Gideon doesn't have the unilateral power to reconvene the legislature, and she has sent out a ballot request to members urging us to return twice. So it's not accurate to say she's not interested in coming back. And I didn't see that level of inaccuracy in the attacks from Susan Collins in our race. The other thing that I found very disappointing was that on the radio last week, Susan made some anti-Semitic remarks. Now, in my position as Executive Director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, we've been doing some work around anti-Semitism because you can see anti-Semitism sometimes on both the right and the left, and it's really important that we recognize it for what it is and stop it. And because, of course, anti-Semitism was one of the contributing factors to the murder, to the Holocaust of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. And so for Susan Collins to make anti-Semitic remarks on the radio, to identify George Soros, Donald Sussman, and Chuck Schumer, 3 Jewish leaders and funders, as backing Sarah Gideon, that's the type of dog whistle that we never saw in 2014. And it was extraordinarily disappointing. And I really expected better of her. So I do think that she's changed in some ways. And in some ways, the country has changed.
Yeah, and she voted with Trump 94% of the time, or something close to that. And so I am with those who say that there's been a fundamental change, and she's following the extreme right wing in a lot of directions that I don't think is consistent with Maine voters and Maine people. So I hope she comes to terms with that at some point. One thing we haven't mentioned, and we should, is the COVID, the approach that Maine has taken addressing the COVID virus. And I know you've worked on some of this in the committee, but where do we stand right now in terms of if we open schools, are we going to have the same reaction that Florida had when they opened their beaches?
I think it'll be really important to move with all deliberate caution. So at this point in time, the Maine Department of Education and Governor Janet Mills have identified all of Maine's 16 counties as in the green zone, meaning that it is safe, at least as safe as it can be at this point in time, for schools to return to in-person instruction or some hybrid model. And what I'm seeing is that many schools are offering that hybrid option. Winthrop schools, for example, in my district, are offering parents the choice to either send their students to school or engage in remote learning. And I think that will probably be the norm for many schools around the state.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in, but I'm afraid we're running out of time, which I was afraid was going to happen. Maybe we can have you back, but I really appreciate your coming and you're joining us today on Maine Challenge, and also to the audience for tuning in. Thank you again, Shenna Bellows, State Senator from Manchester in Southern Kennebec County. Please keep up the good work. You're a really important part of Maine governance, and thank you for all that you do.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Show your support for Maine Challenge and LCTV's programming. We're all about community. Please go to lctv.org to make a contribution. Your support makes us stronger together.